One of the more frequent comments I see is something along the lines of, my build is put together exactly as you suggested, but my DPS is still much lower than yours. What am I missing? And this is a really hard question to answer without knowing more info and really digging into the specific setup and figuring out exactly what is going wrong. However, there are some recurring issues that I started noticing, some that were popping up again and again, and this ended up giving my friend Saligia the idea to put together a DPS checklist, something that you could easily go through and just take it step by step to make sure everything is put together properly for your build. So shout out to Saligia for this checklist and also some really great guides they've put out in the past. So I'll have their YouTube linked in the description. But let's just hop right into the checklist. First up, and one of the most important and most common issues I see, do you weave fast enough? One skill plus one light attack per second without missing too many of them. Nearly every skill in ESO has a 1 second global cooldown, so that is the maximum speed that you can cast your skills once per second. The light attacks are on a separate cooldown, so you can also fit one of these before each skill cast and get them both in that 1 second window. So one of the most common mistakes I see is simply going too slow. Doing a rotation at the maximum speed possible, 1 skill per second, can seem a bit daunting at first to try and keep up everything at that pace, but that is the goal to work towards if you want to maximize your damage. Anything slower than that, and essentially what you're doing is wasting time that could be spent attacking. Now the balance comes with not hitting your skills too fast either, because then you could miss that window for your light attack to be snuck in. I do see that sometimes as well, where someone has a very fast weaving speed, but they miss a ton of their light attacks. So it's really about finding that balance where you're as close to 1 second per skill as possible without missing your light attacks weaved in between. For heavy attack setups, this point is not as important as you are going to be going slower due to the heavies not being instant like light attacks are. So typically you're going to be holding down your heavy attack and basing your rotation off of that pace, so the 1 second GCD part kind of goes out the window. All right, the next item up on the checklist, do you perform your rotation correctly? Good uptime on dots, buffs, casting skills with the correct priorities, etc. So this is probably the second most common thing that I see when it comes to losing potential DPS. Damage over time skills are a bit easier to keep up nowadays since they extended the timers on them in update 35, but it is still very important for your DPS that you are recasting those as close as possible to when they run out. If you are going a bit slow and letting a few seconds go between each recast, you're just losing damage that could be happening. That mostly comes with practice and getting a good feel for your skills and how long they last. But if you are having trouble with this, maybe start with a simpler skill bar loadout, maybe one with 7 or 8 active skills instead of 10, and practice keeping those up the best you can, keeping an eye on your timers ticking down to reapply each right as they are running out. So right here I'm using an add-on called Fancy Action Bar for my timers, but they do have base game ability timers in the settings now that they introduced well over a year ago, so that is an option now even if you don't have access to add-ons. And then the part there about the priority order, this is referring to when you have 2 skills that may be expiring at the same time. It's a bit higher level thinking that goes in once you start really mastering your rotation, where you'll want to make sure to apply the skill that does more damage first if 2 are looking to be expiring at the same time. This part is not a huge deal and you don't need to fret over this too much early on, but it is something that will help you continue to improve your DPS levels as you push higher towards the ceiling. And then there is something else to keep in mind. Some dots will have nice upfront hits to them, like Eruption, for example. If I saw that this was running out at the same time as another one of my dots, like Caltrops, and Caltrops does not have an upfront hit, so if I cast Eruption 1 second early before it runs out, it isn't really a big deal because it does have that upfront hit, and so I'm just pushing that a little bit sooner, and then I could recast Caltrops right after that without losing any time on my dots. So just another in-the-moment, high-level thinking kind of decision that you can make on the fly, but as I said, don't fret over this second part too much. If you're still learning to keep up your abilities, mostly just try and focus on keeping them up as close to 100% of the time as possible. So those two are the biggest things that I see, the speed and the execution of the rotation properly. These generally have a much larger impact on DPS levels than things like not having golded out gear or missing the correct trait on a few items. ESO is a very skill-based game, and so that will generally account for more of it, though missing those small things can definitely add up. If you have too many pieces of the build that are incorrect, you'll definitely start to notice a difference. But I say that because people often attribute a large DPS gap to missing a couple of of specifics within the build itself, and generally that's not accounting for most of that gap. It's the execution of the rotation itself. But all of that said, these next things that we'll go through are still very important, and it's good to double check and make sure that you are set up correctly. So first up, and probably one of the more obvious ones, but it is important, do you have the correct gear, either the best in slot setups or at least the alternatives mentioned in the guides? Having the correct gear layout can make a pretty big difference, though there are often alternative options that will get you very close to the same results. Now, perfected versus non-perfected, that's another one that people sometimes attribute missing a lot of DPS to, but really in most cases, the perfected bonus is a very small increase. Let's take Reliquin, for example, with their line of stamina as a perfected bonus. This is no DPS increase for a Magicka build, or about a 1% increase for a stamina build. Then if we look at the Maelstrom staff, this has a line of penetration on the perfected bonus, but with that being on your back bar and you also generally building for your penetration levels not accounting for that anyways, this is next to an unnoticeable DPS increase for most situations. So don't get too hung up on having the perfected or not. That isn't making or breaking your DPS. Next up, do you have the correct Mundus Stone? Again, this one might seem pretty obvious, but it's nice to double check just in case you're swapping around for different scenarios, or if you are on the PTS testing, the templates do not come with the Mundus Stone active, so you'll need to make sure you grab that before you start. 9 times out of 10, this will be the Thief for PvE DPS. Next up, do you have the correct food buff? This is pretty important as well, and you'll need to make sure that you're stacking into the correct stat and also getting whatever sustain bonuses that you might need. I do have all of the food options for DPS listed on each build page on my website at skinnycheeks.gg if you aren't sure what you should be going with for your build. Next up, do you have gold quality weapons? While gold versus purple makes a very tiny difference on armor pieces and jewelry, you do see a fairly noticeable difference with your weapons. So these should be your first priority to get to gold out of all of the pieces that you're wearing. This directly increases the weapon and spell damage of the weapon and generally is not too expensive to do compared to body pieces and jewelry. Now, speaking of jewelry, I often see people incorrectly state the difference between gold and purple jewelry with the Bloodthristy trait, and they use the final scaled value as the difference in weapon and spell damage. So for example, in the current patch, we have 210 weapon and spell damage difference in 3 jewelry pieces with purple versus gold. But this number is the difference once the enemy is at 0 health remaining. These numbers scale up to that point from 90% health down to 0%. So on average, your difference in purple and gold jewels is only about 95 weapon and spell damage, not 210, almost 32 weapon and spell damage per jewelry piece. And that's actually going to be even less next patch. They have buffed up Bloodthirsty on all non-gold quality jewels, so purple will actually be only an average of just under 48 weapon and spell damage lower than having all 3 pieces gold. So that comes out to just under 16 per piece of jewelry. Pretty small difference overall, but still something. If you are in the position to upgrade, you have the extra mats and you are trying to squeak out every little bit of DPS. All right, next up, do you use potions on cooldown? Now this may seem like another obvious one, but I can't tell you how many times someone has asked me to check out their setup and they weren't even using potions at all. It's really important to keep those buffs up and use our potions every 45 seconds on their cooldown. But this leads us into the next question as well. Do you use the right potion? So depending on how your skills are set up, there are a few different common options to go with. If you have your major buffs covered, you can get away with not using potions that provide those. The major sorcery and brutality is commonly applied with a Dragonite using igneous weapons or with the skill degeneration, and then there are some other sources as well. Then major prophecy and savagery. These are most commonly gained from Inner Light or Camo Hunter, though some classes do have access to these with their class skills as well. So these are huge buffs that are extremely important to your damage. If you're not getting these from skills, you need to make sure that you are getting them from your potions. Next up, do you have the right traits and enchantments? As I mentioned earlier, most of these things are pretty small in their own. For example, not having a Divine's piece of armor is only about 0.5% of crit chance that you'd be missing, or about 3.9% for all 7 Divine's pieces missing. And then the enchantments are also rather small in the damage that they add in, but when coupled with many other deviations from the correct setup, this can all start to add up. These types of small things aren't making or breaking your DPS levels, but they are generally pretty easy fixes and every little bit helps. Next up, do you have the correct attribute points, 64 into stamina or magicka? Even with hybridization, it is still optimal to stack all of our points into either stamina or magicka, whichever route you prefer to take your character. I usually base my choice off my race, so as an Imperial, for example, I'm a bit better suited as a stamina-based DPS, or if I was a Breton, I'd probably go with magicka-based DPS, and then some races are pretty equal for both. End of the day, it doesn't really matter too much which route you go, but just make sure that you do have those 64 points into one or the other, not split between the two. Another thing to check as well is if you're doing a template character on the PTS, these points do not come applied, so make sure to put that in before you start practicing. And then finally, have you unlocked all relevant passives, including medicinal use from alchemy and your slottable champion points? If you are a newer player or you just have a new character that you're working with, sometimes you simply won't have everything unlocked yet, and that's cool. These are just things that you can work towards, but the passives in your skill lines can make a huge difference in your damage numbers. It's always good to double check that you have the ones that are going to contribute to your damage. The medium and the light armor lines are pretty huge, and many of the class and guild skill line passives can add up quite a bit as well. And you can't forget about medicinal use from the alchemy line. This is the only trade skill that is crucial for combat, as it extends our potions out to that full 45 seconds that they have as a cooldown. Without it, you will have downtime on your potion buffs. And then for your champion points, make sure you do have the 4 recommended nodes for your build slotted in the blue warfare tree, and then as many of the passive ones as you can get with the points you have to spend. This is another one that you'll need to make sure you do if you start a PTS template character, as they don't come with any champion points spent. I do have recommended champion point setups for each of the classes on my website at skinnycheeks.gg, as well as a flowchart that can help you determine which ones to slot regardless of your setup. So make sure to check that out if you are struggling to figure out which ones to put in. But that's it for the checklist. Here is the full thing again. If you want to have a reference, I'll have this up on my website as well. Anytime you are getting ready to practice on the trial dummy or whatever you're practicing on, you can do a quick rundown of this and make sure you have checked all the boxes, and you'll be good to go to get the best results possible. Thanks a bunch for watching. I hope this video helps simplify some of the key things to look at when comparing your damage levels to those in the builds that you're checking out. If you have any questions, definitely recommend joining my Discord, as we have discussions all the time around ESO, and lots of people, including myself, are happy to help out in there. Or you can just leave a comment here on the video. I want to give a shout out to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. The contributions help a ton to keep the website and YouTube channel going. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougarous Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Iffy, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Vidridi, Florian, Phoenix, Nalandia, Unemployed, Chryseliana, Cha-Cha, and Technical KO. Thanks again, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.